All right, we are coming up on the 60th anniversary of President JFK being assassinated. But after 6 decades, people are still searching for answers. They want to know what really happened on November 22nd, 1963, and everything that led up to that day. To help cut through the mystery, I've asked Dr. John Newman to come on and share new insight with us, while at the same time dispelling old insight that's maybe distracting us. John, thank you so much for coming on and welcome to today's show.
Love it. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah. So I want to strike a balance between understanding this Lee Harvey Oswald character, also President Kennedy. He's a little bit of a mystery to people. At the same time, I was going to ask you, who didn't like Kennedy? But I guess maybe the better question is who did like him? After watching some of your other interviews, there was a lot of dissenting opinions against him and some of the, at the time, radical things that he wanted to introduce. But I'm excited to go through that. Now, you are a friend of Robert Kennedy Jr., correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And there's a point in history where some of the material that you researched and published changed the trajectory of this story and reopened the Congress's desire to research and get to the truth. So maybe we start with that, and I believe that had to do with your first book. So tell us a little bit about why you got into doing this research, and then how that first book really changed the timeline and the commitment to finding out the truth.
At one point in my military career, working in the National Security Agency for the director, there was a lot of stuff that happened before that I got to that point. But he was an interesting guy, General Odom, William E. Odom. He was a world-renowned historian himself, a criminologist. And so I traveled with him all over the place whenever he went somewhere. And one day we were going down to a classified Navy site in the Carolinas, and I had the suitcase full of all the stuff and everything, and he was sitting there reading his New York Times, and I was in the middle of finishing up my PhD, and he asked me, he put his paper down, he said, "John, what are you doing your dissertation on?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing it on the succession to Mao Zedong in China." I had 3 degrees in that. It's my PhDs in modern foreign history and history. So I thought, I knew a lot about that, and I knew some things that were new. And so I thought that was a good idea. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, come on, John. That's too easy for you. Why don't you show some mettle and step outside your safety box and do something really new?" And see, and that is, he's actually right, because there is a tradition which most people don't follow because they're scared, which is that your dissertation should overturn an orthodoxy or break new ground, or both. So I was just taken aback, and I said, "All right, sir, let me just ask you this one question. If I told you that President Kennedy was pulling out of Vietnam at the time he died, what about that?" And he sat there for about 60 seconds, and he said, "You know what? If you could make a good case for that, that'd be great." And he went back right to his newspaper. That was the end of that conversation. So when we got back to Fort Meade, I called my dissertation advisor, Dick Thornton, at James Madison, at George Washington at the time, and I said, "Dick, I want to change my subject." He said, "To what?" I said, "JFK in Vietnam." He said, "I thought you'd never ask." And that was, the rest is history. That's how it became the subject. I knew quite a lot about it, but then I was fortunate because it was at that time that the State Department and other elements in the government released all of the JFK files. I don't want to say all the kind of stuff we've got now, but just his policy stuff, all those meetings and things like that were dumped on the table right at the time I was writing the dissertation. So I was very lucky to have the complete story. Now, at that point, we still called it a hypothesis. And I wrote the book with that as a hypothesis, and so, but what happened was after the book was out, it was suppressed for years. That's a whole other story. But just to finish up here, when it eventually came out, it caused just a huge food fight between the left and the right, and I couldn't figure out if I just ducked, maybe there's stuff would hit each other and cancel them out. But that's the point at which people began to really dig, and what they found with all these tapes in the White House that showed it wasn't a hypothesis. It was true. Kennedy was sitting there talking about it with McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, and everybody else. And so over the years, even though we still have some people trying to say, oh, no, Kennedy was this or that, it's over. It's been over for a long time. Kennedy didn't want to go in. As a matter of fact, he kept us out of Armageddon 3 times in his administration. That's another thing we could talk about. You and I wouldn't be here if it weren't for John Kennedy.
The question always comes up, who did this? There's people that are convinced the CIA took out Kennedy. There's people that believe the FBI was involved. There's people that believe maybe these mobsters out of Illinois were involved. You've kind of posited that there could be some U.S. military involvement, but so I want to tease that out, pick your brain on that. But at the same time, as I've listened to you and as I've been reading The Unthinkable, so much of this comes down to interrupting the flow of money and bodies to this Vietnam War. So did this come down to trying to control a U.S. president into a war and to keep money flowing, or was it a combination of all of it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a combination of all of it. We'll get into the Vietnam thing. But the first thing I have to address is the first part of what you were just talking about. Look, these people who say, it's Colonel Mustard with the wrench, or it's this or that, don't understand the structure of large, not these small countries, which the United States and the Soviet Union were the 2 big gorillas for a long time, and you had to line up with one side or the other. You got stomped on. They were the 2 big, gorillas in the jungle. And but when we're talking about the United States or the Soviet Union or the British or the French, these are big. They're large. They're the ones who had, especially the Europeans, had all reign over the whole world. They owned all these other countries and made them do this and that, and so on. Well, that's began to change in the 20th century, but the French, they held on forever. But anyway, the point is, in these large countries, there is the way they work is different than the way the small countries that all have to bow and kowtow to the big ones. And that is how the hierarchy actually is. What is the structure? Before you start saying, the military or the CIA, you have to understand in any of these big countries how they operate. At the top of is the hierarchies of the political and military. And the political is first, at least it's supposed to be in a democracy. And the president has the power to fire everybody. And that was the first mistake Kennedy made. He was scared of the CIA and the military. And he didn't change anything. He did all these great things. We brought in so many people who knew how to do economics and the money thing. By the time we got to the end of his 3 years, my God, there was so much money he had created by cutting taxes that the rich and the middle class and the lower classes all had money. It's never happened again, but it happened under John Kennedy because he did things differently. He brought in the people who really understood economics. Now, if the president doesn't take all these guys out, which he should have done, that's on him, but he had the power. So the power always is with the political elite. The military is right there by him, though, because if there's a coup d'etat in any of these big countries, guess who does it? You think it's their spy service can do that? Where is the power? Even in a tiny country, it's the military. If there's a coup d'etat, it is not done by a spy service. Unless it's the big guys who are manipulating a small country where they own and have installed a tin pot dictator and money only for a military to keep all the prices of all the stuff they do very low for American corporations. This is what happened in Central and South America. So, you know, the point is that you have to understand there's a military political hierarchy first. Now, this was all happening, what we're saying, and when we're not talking about 1600, we're talking about the 20th century. And this is what, after the end of the World War II, we were talking about something, the Cold War. Why is it cold? Because the military hierarchy and political hierarchy, obviously, are not shooting bombs and bullets at each other. But it's still a war. So who's fighting a war in the Cold War? And the answer is the logical extension of the political military hierarchies, and that would be their spy services. That's who does assassinations sometimes, but more likely it's deception. That is really the biggest game going on. It's espionage and counter-espionage, and if you don't understand that, you cannot. It's hard to talk about any of this stuff because those are the ones that were playing. And they had infiltrated each other. Makes it even more difficult to understand. It's a mess. And before I hand you the mic back, I'm going to say this about it. Look, there are good generals and good CIA people. They're not all bad. It doesn't work that way. And so in the end, it's not just all black and white too, like we're good and they're bad. There were defections going in both directions. We had a lot of our guys, like this mole we're going to talk about, Bruce Sully, that wasn't found all this time. He was working for the KGB all along. He and McCord were flyers over Germany. They were bombardiers, working with the Russian, pilots over Germany, and they were very close. And that's where they were recruited. But there's a ton of people coming over from the from the KGB to us. And then we got a whole bunch of our people going over the other side. So what the hell's going on? It's because apparently people who are in those spy servers both think, I don't like what my country's doing. So it's not like it's just one country and everybody's going to the West. It's going both ways. So besides it being complicated, it does tell you something else. That these giant big countries with all their power and all their ability to manipulate things, when people who are inside of the structure and see it and don't like it, tend to rebel. So before we paint everything black this way and white that way, it's not like that. You have to look at every situation and in every country and every administration to come to some conclusion about whether you think were doing the right thing for the people or whatever, or not. But it's not something that is just a straight line that's never going to change. It's not the way it works. It's difficult.
Yeah. Well, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But as I've been going through your newest book, I've been shocked at how much espionage was going on and how much the KGB had really infiltrated our country and our government. And I assume we had infiltrated their country and government. And so, yeah, there's these spy networks going on behind the scenes. But on the Concrete podcast, you kind of alluded to the fact that something like taking out a president, a coup d'etat, does involve some kind of military action or participation. Do you think Kennedy's presidency was difficult because of coming into things that were already set in motion under Eisenhower? Or do you think it's because he, rebelled against the military being able to do all of the different stuff in Cuba right out of the gate? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's all those are good questions, each one of which could take a long time to answer. So the Cold War, where do I start? The Vietnam War, it doesn't come along until late in the game. Let me start here. At the end of World War II, there was this idea called the Scare of 1948 that Stalin was just going to take all of Europe because the French had they had been completely wiped out, and of course Germany was cut up into little pieces. So there's no standing army really on the continent itself. There's the Great Britain still has one, but they lost a lot of their guys. So that's why there's not a whole lot of young men in England for a long time. So that was an idea, but it was totally stupid. Stalin had enough problems holding down Eastern Europe, which they had taken for them, and he had no intention of doing it. So, but because of that, there was an idea that what we should do is prepare for it by getting a lot of World War II weapons and things like that, and putting them in holes in the ground all over Western Europe, so that when the big horde of communist countries zipped across the continent, these would be people behind lines that could dig up the stuff and use it, communications and stuff. But most of them were assassins and saboteurs and things like that. And of course, in Germany, it was mostly ex-Nazis, and in Italy, a lot of assassins in Italy. And so each one of these countries, and this caused something called Gladio, which was started at about that time, almost 1950, 49, 50. MI6 and the CIA were using all that stuff in all the Western European countries to blow stuff up, assassinate people, and blame it on the socialists and communists. Now, so what you learn from that, you need not to be judgmental in terms of who's right, who's wrong. And what you need to understand is it's about power. And the power here was a binary decision, binary choice between communism and capitalism, is the way they framed it, which is too vague, but but that structure is what was happening. And so the only way that it was going to be resolved was one was going to win and one was going to lose. At least that's what the hierarchies thought, including Eisenhower if he had to. But Kennedy had a different idea about it, and that things changed there. But that's 1963. So all during that time, you have this growing, and this is it's so complicated, but we were growing at a phenomenal rate in the nuclear weapons department. And Khrushchev, they just didn't have the kind of technology that the United States did. So Khrushchev started an ICBM program. They did manufacture short range and medium range little missiles that they could put a warhead on, which is just as dangerous as another one, but their reach, it doesn't reach the United States, for example. So what he decides to do, and you have to understand that there was, when I discussed this about what Khrushchev was up to in the Soviet Union, you have to understand that when Stalin died, with a little help from the Kevorkian guy who wanted to murder this guy because nobody liked him because he kept killing everybody. Anyway, when he died, there was a succession struggle that went on for 4 years, Malenkov, Molotov, and Khrushchev won narrowly. And by 1956, 57, he's in charge. And so but they're standing in the wings, just waiting for him to stumble one time to take his job from him. So he doesn't want anything to go wrong. So what does he do when their first ICBM which has got to go all the way across Europe. It doesn't hit the target. It doesn't even come close. And how do we know this? Because CIA made something called the U-2. So we were flying U-2s, for example, out of Atsugi, Japan, where we could see that none of those missiles could even remotely hit any target. So really what he did was to stop the program, the SS-6 program, and go for second generation, while publicly threatening us in every little crisis here and there that he was going to use his ICBMs, his intercontinental ballistic missiles. It was called the Great Missile Bluff. And it went on and on, all the way through the Eisenhower administration. And during the campaign in 1960, believe it or not, is when, because one of the U-2s had been shot down, it was already in train for the SR-71, which was so fast nobody could shoot anything at it. But the thing that really changed the equation that happened in that time, in 1960, were satellites in outer space, and they could see everything all over the Soviet Union, and they could see there was nothing there, that it had been a lie. So that's pretty interesting. I mean, the election hasn't been decided yet. This is October, November, September, October, November, right in that time frame. But this is top secret code word stuff. It never got out in the news. They were still saying, I mean, the hardliners on the right were saying, this is terrible. They got all this stuff. We've got to make more ICBMs. And especially Curtis LeMay, the head of the Air Force, he wanted more. He didn't care whether it was true or not. He just wanted more weapons. He wanted to blow the pogies out of the Soviet Union and China, which is what most of the Joint Chiefs did want by that point. Those that had succeeded, all these guys were back in World War II. And they ended up owning everything. I mean, not owning, but running everything in the Kennedy administration. And he should have got rid of all of them, and he never did. Their idea was, we need to do this now. Let's get it over with. So they wanted to actually use these weapons before the Soviet Union could catch up. So in the Cold War, it's actually better if both sides have the same power. You're much less likely to have nuclear weapons going off in that situation than when one country gets, so much stuff. And so that's what happened. If you'll indulge me, I will tell you what happened in the Kennedy administration when we get to this point, because the idea here is to look at this guy as a young whippersnapper who doesn't know anything about anything. He only had a little PT boat. Lemnitzer, who was our Joint Chiefs of Staff, used to make fun of that, about Kennedy, just, his little PT boat, like he was nothing. But no, Kennedy was a lot smarter than Lemnitzer in a lot of ways. But every year, since the advent, especially of long-range ballistic missiles, that's intercontinental, that changes everything, okay? Because if you don't have those, and it's the United States and the Soviet Union, they could see us, we could see them massing things at airports, not airports, but airstrips, military bases and stuff. And then they got to fly over the North Pole. And so there's just this long time period between the time that one side understands that there's going to be an ICBM coming their way. They've got several weeks to see it coming, until the intercontinental ballistic missile that could go 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 kilometers. All of a sudden, that reduces weeks to less than an hour. So that's why the ICBM war changed everything in military and particularly nuclear power and what that means in the world. Who's going to be running the world? And so we're going at a frenetic breakneck pace. And it turns out, of course, as I just said, the United States ends up getting all these weapons, but who knows it, and how does that affect what happens in the administrations? Well, the presidents are allowed to know what's going on, so they get to know the secret stuff. And so how do they know it? Well, the military has to tell them what we have. And how they do that started in the Eisenhower administration when these nuclear weapons were after, you know, Truman and everybody else. It kept this going, this production of nuclear weapons going. So they came up with something in the Eisenhower administration, which was used afterwards, which is called the Net Evaluation Subcommittee, the NES. Now, it was a subcommittee of the National Security Council, but it was a subcommittee that was by military guys, the top military guys. They would have the head of the CIA with them in the briefing. But what it was to brief, okay, it was a briefing on the SIOP to the president, SIOP. There's not a whole lot of acronyms you need to know, but if you want to talk about these things, you need to know that that's a single integrated operational plan for nuclear warfare.
Okay.
A single plan. So that's the suitcase. That's got the PSYOP in it. Okay. And so the first one was given to Eisenhower. And he was aghast at the time when he found out that even no matter what happened, they could fly big airplanes and drop a nuclear bomb on the United States. And so no matter what we did, we were going to lose just millions upon millions, 100 million, 500,000, you know, 250,000, whatever. It just depends on the scenario of our own people. And anyway, his guy didn't make it. Nixon didn't make it. And it's another whole long story how the hell Kennedy got in there. And Martin Luther King, without him, it wouldn't never have happened. That's another whole interesting story. But let's just stay with it. So here it is. A guy comes in who actually was embarrassing the Republican Party because Eisenhower had, and this answers another question of what was going on at the time. Well, what was going on at the time was the Bay of Pigs. That was the Eisenhower holdover program that was inherited by somebody who wasn't supposed to inherit it, John F. Kennedy. Nixon was supposed to be the guy that was going to be taking the reins at that point. And so the Bay of Pigs was something that originated with Eisenhower that was so secret that he swore everybody, they couldn't say anything about it. And he meant business. Now, he wanted it to be so secret. Here was the original plan. They were going to take some CIA guys and military guys and send them outside of the United States, outside of Cuba in another place, where they would train these people on how to make groups of people that would end up with insurgent warfare type stuff. So it's going to happen outside of this country and outside of this other place. Then the next step is those guys that they trained, they go into Cuba and train people. So our hands are clean. Nobody knows. This was Eisenhower's plan. And then those guys would make groups that would recruit other people, and then eventually they'd overthrow Castro. Now, the problem with that is that, well, Castro fooled us. We didn't do too much. He pretended he was on our side. He was Time Magazine, on the cover of Time Magazine, and all the while he was actually working with the Communist Party in Moscow. And then suddenly that happens. It comes out, and all of a sudden everybody's really angry on our side and Eisenhower really browbeat Dulles. He said, "Why didn't you tell me this stuff? You had plenty of intel." Anyway, so what happens is just as about the time, in fact, at the time that Kennedy is elected, it starts about a week beforehand and continues in the 2 weeks after his election, not his inauguration, his election in November. They have a meeting of the top guys of the National Security Council, and they all say, it's done. It's a terrible plan. There's artillery and tanks coming in to Cuba from the Eastern Bloc, and they've got all these guys, these KGB guys, who come and showing the Cubans spy services how to eliminate and take care of all these groups, these anti-Castro groups. There's no way that this invasion of exiles, these trained exiles, is going to do anything. It's going to have to be, they can start something, we're using them to start something, but we're going to have to send in the Marines and the Air Force. Now, the problem comes after Kennedy actually gets elected. He has to be briefed on the Cuban problem. And so the briefing, which is done by the Deputy Director of Plans of the CIA, he goes down there to Florida, to the Kennedy compound down there, and he doesn't tell him the truth, doesn't tell him this is what's going to happen. So it isn't until early February, he's after his inauguration, the first meeting on Cuba. And there's the Joint Chiefs, there's Lemnitzer, he's the big guy, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and a couple others. And so in probably within 2 or 3 minutes, Kennedy looks at him and he says, well, tell me about the plan in Cuba. What do you think about it? Lemnitzer says it's terrible, it'll never work. But we have something that will work. And Lemnitzer just stops there. And so that's like the lollipop, the Kennedy's supposed to say, okay, what is that you have that'll work? Kennedy just folds his arms and sits back. He doesn't say anything. Uh-oh. That's not good. If you're sitting there and you're Lemnitzer, right? So nothing happens at that point, but then they have a second meeting a few days later. And again, Kennedy asked the question, and Lemnitzer repeats the same thing. It's terrible. It's never going to win. They can't do it. They'll get smashed to pieces. And again, he offers that they have a plan, and nothing happens. At that point, the Joint Chiefs decide, oh shit, he's not going to go for it. And he's probably, if we don't do something quick, he's going to just call the whole thing off. He hadn't done that yet. He was waiting to make a decision because he was the president. And here was an Eisenhower holdover program. It was about war against Cuba, because he had actually, in the campaign said, you Republicans, you let communism come 90 miles from our border, and he hit them and said, they're not doing anything, but they were doing all the secret stuff. And I think Kennedy even knew that. In fact, I know he did. And he was still using it because he wasn't supposed to know anything. So in the campaign, he bashed Nixon with that, and Nixon wasn't allowed to say anything because Eisenhower forbade it. So now that he's president, they're looking at him like saying, okay, you said all this stuff. Those are promises you got to keep, right? Well, do you remember you've probably seen the footage. We will bear any price, we'll bear any burden. It was a very aggressive speech. And now that he's in, all of a sudden his first speech was, we found out a lot of stuff we didn't know. And anybody who gets in this has to be very scared about this and that and the other. Anyway, they say, okay, third meeting, oh, it's fine. The plan is just fine. And so then there's questions back and forth. How is it fine? And they have to do a big report. And, there's in a big report, you have a great big report, but then you have just the what did you call the little part on the front, the 1-page summary of everything.
Summary.
Yeah, the executive summary says everything's fine, but when you go into the fine print, it's all there. Anyway, you know what happens. I don't want to waste any more of our time because it would be wasting now. There's enough for you to see on the table. The Joint Chiefs figured out Kennedy wasn't going to do it. So what they had to make sure is that he would still go for it. And so that last part went like this. He says, I will never send combat troops in there. We're not going to go to war in Cuba. They're the ones, we'll go ahead and give them. And he said, I want you to know that's what's going to happen. Or do you understand? And they all said, oh, yeah, we understand. And then he asked the exile leaders. He said, if you guys can't make it, I'm not coming in. Do you understand that? Do you still want to go? Oh, yes. They all thought, no way in hell, once the exiles are on the beach getting murdered to pieces, getting shot to pieces, that Kennedy isn't going to change his mind. They were wrong. That's what happened. They got They were being slaughtered on the beachhead. And they went to Kennedy. It was in the middle of a big, one of those big social things in the White House, and the Joint Chiefs came in and made him go into the other room, and they said, "It's time, we got to go." And he said, "No, the hell with you guys. You know what the deal was." And that was when the motive began. That ends up in 1963. You need more than just the motive, but that's when it started. Kennedy was so afraid of these guys, he knew he was going to fire them all, including this Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA. But he waited until the end of the year for the first one, and then he waited 3 more months. He didn't want it to look like he was in trouble, I guess. So he wanted to kind of slide them out the door. There's so much more that was going on. Berlin crisis is coming at the end of the year. But anyway, that's enough just to put it on the table for you to see. They thought this was a pipsqueak guy that they could manipulate, and they couldn't in the end. And it got worse and worse. But the bottom line is they wanted to take out the Soviet Union and China and every other communist country on earth because we had the power to do it. What they didn't know is that they had done that, they wouldn't have lived, and you and I wouldn't be here. And the only thing left on the planet, it was a hydrogen bomb by then. And the plan called for 3 bombs on each target in the Soviet Union, 3 just to make sure, and China. So the only thing that would be alive for a long time might be a little worm 18 inches below the surface, if there was anything to eat down there, because everything on the surface was going to be, dependent on the isotopes, the radiation, and all the stuff, and the nuclear winter and all that stuff. And so that's what would have happened, but that's what they wanted. So in that first year, after the Bay of Pigs failed and Kennedy took the blame for it, he stood up in front of the cameras like a big boy and said, "It's my fault." He brought on the Maxwell Taylor to be part of, and Bobby, a look at the Bay of Pigs thing. They had a murder board, and it didn't, okay, so they found that out. But that's when and then Khrushchev gave him a whacking at the Vienna thing, because Khrushchev, who thought Kennedy was going to be a good guy to be sort of friendly with, and when he saw what happened in the Bay of Pigs, he thought, aha, this guy's weak. And so Khrushchev changed his mind and decided that he wanted to take Berlin. And at the Vienna conference, that's what he confronts Kennedy with. So Kennedy's at his sort of nadir here between, and it got all in the news and everything, the browbeating that he took, at Vienna. And then, what happened in the Bay of Pigs. So that's when this PSYOP briefing was due, was the summer of 61, which was supposed to be for the next fiscal year, which would be mid-62. But they didn't do that. They decided to give him a PSYOP briefing, but a different one. So when Lemnitzer gets up there, he says, here's what we think. We have the capability, and we will have the capability to completely wipe out the communist countries, the Russians and the Chinese. And we can do that without any severe damage to the United States, even the Europeans, because we have this power. And he said when you compare the nuclear forces that we have versus what they have, and lay it out over time, what you're going to see, the point of maximum difference. In other words, the window will be the widest it's ever going to be, that we have mostest, and they got leastest is going to be in the fall of 1963. This is in July 1961. This is a briefing, not about the next PSYOP, but about a PSYOP that will happen in the fall of 1963. And that idea, by the way, was still alive in the fall of 1963. Okay, and a whole lot of stuff happened in between that, including the Oswald stuff and the Soviet Union and stuff. But I'll stop there. That is, and we haven't even said really too much about how and who and all that in the end. But that's It was coming because that's what they wanted. They wanted, and they looked at Kennedy as a weakling. And so they thought it didn't matter. He didn't matter in the equation, and they were going to do it.
Yeah.
They were going to take over the world.
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, they say you're only as strong as your weakest link, and yet the weakest link ends up saving all of us from blowing ourselves to kingdom come with this plan. I want to talk about this mole that you researched, this person that's able to infiltrate and make these you know, big moves quietly, or small moves quietly, but that affected us. So tell us about uncovering this mole.
Okay. I spent a little time. We're going to give more time than an hour, but that was as quick as I could do it for that piece. Now, I mentioned McCord, which is a name everybody knows from Watergate, right? But the name Bruce Sully isn't known to very many people. Bruce Sully and McCord, as I said, were both working together as bombardiers in World War II. They both came into the CIA in 1951 when it was truly created. There were pieces of the CIA being put together before that, but for all intents and purposes, the CIA we know all the pieces were finally together in 51. That's when these two guys came in. And they'd already been recruited. We don't know when. We just know that as soon as, and the thing is, when you recruit somebody, an espionage plan successfully recruit somebody, does that mean you use them the next morning? No. You've got somebody in place who's very valuable, depending on where they are in this political military hierarchy. So if it's just a small guy, let's say in a division or even a branch somewhere in the CIA, that's a low level mole there, penetration. And so sometimes they'll even not even help their low level penetrations can be throwaways. Let me put it that way. And you don't like that if you're the mole, and all of a sudden they've thrown you to the wolves, and the other side knows about it because you can get killed. But what about if you get a penetration, not at a low level place, but at the best place ever in the other side? And in the CIA, it works like this. The group called the Office of Security investigates everybody else, not just in the CIA. This is the Office of Security in the CIA. It has responsibility. Actually, there's 6 branches in the security office. I should lay this out real quick. One of those branches is called the Security Research Staff. And in the Security Research Staff, there's a research desk, and there's other desks. That desk, which is a branch level unit in a staff unit of the Office of Security, has the following remit. They get to know all about and decide what to do with all, well, first of all, any body who's is a defector. Anybody that is classified as a false defector. Any mole, any penetration up by a mole, and the personnel files of every single person in the CIA. All of that at that one desk. You might as well be the head of the CIA. And the problem with the security office is they couldn't be investigated. They were the investigators. So we knew that there was this mole. We'd never found him out. And we knew about it because we had a mole from their side. His name was Pyotr Popov. That's why we call him Popov's mole. He told us about a mole later. He didn't know the name of the mole. But so we knew there was a mole, but we didn't know his name. He was never used for years because Khrushchev knows because the political guys know things that are very, very important and unknown to just about anybody else inside of the Soviet Union. There were one or two guys that were trusted by the hierarchy of the Soviet Union, and so that's where Khrushchev got his information from, and he knew right away, going way back in 52, 53 in there, that they had this mole, but they hadn't used him, and they don't want to use him. Why? Because there wasn't a war going on. It was just the Cold War. Why spend it? Because once you use that source, it could be over. And if you got something at the top of the other guy's stuff, you wait. You wait until the time is right, because you don't know if you're ever going to see it again. Ideally, when we're in the middle of a huge war is when you want to bring that guy into play, because he's probably going to, have to be burned in order to win that war. And that's exactly what happens in 56 and 57. There is a war, and Eisenhower decides not to play, and Moscow decides not to play. They really didn't want to do it, but the reason why it started was because of Soviet influence was just going crazy, popping up all over the Middle East. And so Great Britain and France and Israel decided that this was the time to go in there and take care of business in the Middle East, grab the Suez Canal and conquer the Egyptian army and all that. And so Eisenhower didn't want to do that. But he didn't trust and didn't know what the hell the Russians were going to do. So he had to find out. Well, he was in good luck, because the CIA had just made the U-2 by that point. And all the people we had airdropped in over the years or came across the border were instantly killed, because they knew they had too many penetrations of our side. So we never were able to insert people. Never worked. So in order to find out what the hell was going on, and the only thing that Eisenhower wanted to know is, are the Soviet Union going to join in this war? And that's easy. If you got U-2s, you fly over, railway lines and things like that, and look for troop movements and things like that, because they don't have a whole lot of roads in Russia. They really don't. So it's pretty easy to do that. And so the first thing he allowed was the U-2s to fly over Poland and East Germany. But as the crisis heated up in the Middle East, he decided to let them fly over the Soviet Union to see. Now, Khrushchev sees these things, and he's very frustrated, because can you imagine if all these planes were flying over the United States, like these balloons, and you'd shoot them down?
Yeah, we get one Chinese balloon and throw a fit.
Yeah, and we'll shoot it down. And so that's what he wanted to do. He couldn't do it because they say, so many thousands of feet. It was more like, it wasn't 20,000 or 50,000. It was more like 70 or 80,000 feet high. And the Soviet radars, they could kind of see it, but they couldn't hit it. And so what Khrushchev knew the whole time, though, was that this mole that they had in the CIA had the technical details of the U-2, because the security office has security of the U-2 program. It's a CIA program on top of it. So they know all about that. And so here's Khrushchev, and these guys are waiting to purge him and get him out of the way. Now you got these guys, these U-2s buzzing all over your country. You want to shoot the damn thing down. You know what he says? He tells his spy service, you guys are going to send some good people, the best people we got. You're going to send them over to Washington. You're going to go find that mole. You're going to talk to him and get those details and bring them back to me so I can shoot the damn thing down. And that was the beginning of the most ballsy KGB operation overseas ever, which was these guys were going over there. They were going to have to find the mole some kind of way, going to find Sully, go to a place, certainly not in one of their safe houses. It's got to be some other safe house. And they can't do it. They 3 Russians walking around Washington looking for safe houses are going to look like 3 Russians looking for safe houses. They need an American to do that for them. And we just happened to have the first CIA station in the Soviet Union had just happened. It was just one guy, because the State Department didn't want to have any CIA guys. That was the rule, but the CIA decided they would do it behind their back. And so they had this guy, Ellis Smith, who had been there working on economics and stuff, and his wife was at home, and he was all by himself. And so in the spring of 56, a guy by the name of Kovshok, who was the head KGB working against our embassy, decided, to make sure that his maid was pretty. And next thing you know, he falls into a sex trap. And he's really scared to death about it, because they walked right in with all the cameras and everything right in the middle of the act. Wow. But Kovshok said, hey, don't worry, everything is cool. We just got to do a couple little things for us. We're going to give you a lot of money. You're going to have a great job in the United States for the rest of your life. And they made this big thing that told him exactly he had to wait and cry in front of the ambassador and tell the ambassador and do all this stuff to pretend like he hadn't defected, but he really was. But they had to get this guy back, and they had to do it securely, and that's where McCord came in. McCord was actually above Sully in the security office. He was the deputy chief of that security research staff that Sully had the research branch in. So he's technically over Sully, but anyway, I got his travel records. I got McCord's travel records, and it said July 14th or 15th, 1956, cleared for travel in WE, that's Western Europe, cleared for travel in EE, Eastern Europe, and cleared for travel in Soviet denied territory, mission to bring Edward Ellis Smith back to the United States, where he's going to be interrogated and, thrown out of the CIA. And so McCord is the one who brought him back and actually helped him find the safe houses. Pretended he wasn't in the CIA, he'd been disciplined, so he's walking around the streets with his hands in his pockets, looking like a hobo, down on his luck, and the bucket brigade of the FBI pays no attention to him. Gives him plenty of time for the next several months to find all the safe houses for this team, 3 people who are going to have false passports, and separately, 5 separate planes, and they all connect down there, and this guy has the safe houses for them. That all has to happen before they even get their false passports. So anyway, it was all set. They went over there, met with Sully, found out the tech details. It all went without a hitch, and they went back. But then Sully had to do something else, because by this point, Popov, it was time to take him down. He was so terrible with his he had a mistress on the side, and he took insane risks to send us all this good stuff. He was given George Kieswalter. Anyway, so the long story short here is that worked. Sully even got on the plane after the meeting in Washington and flew to Eastern Europe. Actually stayed in Zurich, which is right on the borderline, and went to the places in Vienna and Berlin where Popov had been to dig up dirt in order to arrest him without exposing himself or McCord. And that worked. Another 6 or 7 months. That only took about a month and a half. But anyway, they wait for a while, and then when Kovshok goes back, gives Khrushchev what he wants, it's over. And McCord says, okay, you're good to go now. And they had it all laid out for him. He was given a big job at the Hoover Institute, the university. It's by Stanford University, and a huge amount of money for the rest of his life. And that was the Edward Ellis Smith portion of this. And so they got the technical details, and they were able to shoot it down eventually. But by that time, we had satellites. But that was the first time that the mole was actually forced into it. And when I was writing volume 4, which is Armageddon, I still haven't had a chance to publish it yet, because while we were working on Armageddon, the thing you held up, this thing all of a sudden came into view, and my inside folks who said, John, you got to call a book out and do that by itself. It's a standalone. I resisted for a while, but then I realized, no, we got to do this. And so we spent 18 months doing it. And then when I found, one of the things I found people don't look at, besides NARA documents, they don't look at Ancestry.com. And it turns out that in 2010, Ancestry put tons of terabytes, the entire world of travel, all the airline stuff. This is not espionage or CIA. This is just boats and airplanes. And it's everything. And believe it or not, I found Sully's travel records and put his boots on the ground at every single point across here. And McCord's everywhere he was. But it was the fact that I had used McCord's travel records in an appendix that the CIA, which had some people inside of the Amazon Kindle people, were able to stop it for a while. Anyway, I made monkeys of them. I won't go into the details of that, but they gave up. And so the book is out. So that's the story about Bruce Sully, but McCord ends up being the bigger story. I only had some of the pieces that he did for that operation back in 56, 57. Turns out that's a lead that we hadn't followed. And so I started following those leads in the past 6 months. And guess what I find? McCord and all his boot prints are the whole trip of Oswald to the Soviet Union. That's who is helping Oswald get that quickie visa, is James McCord again. And so I'm happy to break this on your show. But yeah, I fortunately did not publish the digital version of Popov's Mole. I've waited. And so now we're going to publish the digital version, but it's a revision, and we're going to have all these new chapters in it. So it's coming up at the end of the year, maybe by January. So we're getting close to that. And that's the latest where everything stands sort of thing. We haven't talked about, the Kennedy assassination, and there are a lot of things I could tell you about that. But I think it's not bad for 1 hour. We got through quite a bit here.
Yeah, in the book, something as I read, I kept seeing the word false defector. So was Lee Harvey Oswald a false defector, or?
Yes, but that's not the question. Was he witting? Was he witting? You see, usually you should be if you're a false defector, but you can be used as a defector and not know about it, and it's still a false defection because you're being, you don't know what's going on, right? So you can be manipulated into a defection thinking you're really a defector. But Oswald knew about it because he was programmed of what to say and what not to say. But the bigger question about Oswald, and I wish I'd put it this way in the book, but certainly we'll be talking about it in the revision. The question is, who decided that they needed to use this guy Oswald to go over there? Now, they had other defectors like Oswald who went over and redefected. So it looks like there's a mess of people sent over there, 4 or 5 of them, a lot of Marines, 3 of them at least were Marines. So Oswald doesn't stand out until you actually get into the inside of this whole story. But so it's the whole context of what happened with that first war in the Middle East that is the reason why they had to do something. And here's what happened. Sully was known early on, but we didn't know. We didn't even know really about him for sure until 1958. That's after even 57, when all the stuff that I said happened in Washington and so on. Popov was a major, eventually a lieutenant colonel in the GRU, that's Soviet Military Intelligence. And he had been given us all this stuff. And his case officer, George Kieswalter, and he met regularly, and they could see, based upon the requests for him to come back to Moscow, that it was over, that the KGB had been watching him the whole time, and they had been. And there were 3 or 4 times where he was so insecure that they knew that he had done it, but they didn't arrest him yet because the real source was Sully and McCord on him, on the mole. And so they wanted Popov to be arrested with using some other excuse for his arrest, so it wouldn't be linked to any of the moles back in the United States. And so they knew all about that back in 56, but Popov hadn't said anything to us. He didn't about it. He said nothing about it. And so we don't really know when he found out, probably right away, pretty early, because he was probably, and this is where James McCord comes in again. James McCord was over there all the time. We've got all of his TDYs over there. He was there 8 or 9 times in 5 years, because he was supposed to go travel over there. And so in Vienna and Berlin is where the spies go across the lines all the time. And that's where Popov was. And that's where McCord was. And so that's probably where the link happens. And so now you've got a situation where the KGB knows that it's dangerous, but we don't know who it is. And we might not even know that. It really depends on how many other moles there are. But anyway, what happens in the end is, at the moment that the case officer, Kieswalter, and Popov know that it's over, is when he finally is told that he's being forced to go back to Moscow. And the second to last meeting, Kieswalter tells him, if you don't come over now to the United States, you're going to get killed. You're going to get arrested and killed. And he said, I know. My wife and kids, though, they're in Russia, so I'm going to go there. He knew he was going to die, but he didn't want to. That was his decision. So in the very next meeting, when he says goodbye to Kieswalter, he says, "Oh, by the way, there's a mole, a high echelon mole in the CIA who has the technical details of the U-2. Well, that's really old news, except for one thing. What do you think his case officer does after he learns that? He goes to his boss, who's head of the Soviet Russia division, and he goes to his boss, not his boss, but he goes to the person he has to, which is the counterintelligence chief, James Angleton, who gave everything to Kim Philby, by the way, because he was, it's another whole thing, the story. But anyway, Angleton goes right to Sully and tells him. Sully replaced Philby as the big mole for finding out all secrets of the Western spy services. So here's the point. In 1958, Sully knows that we know about him. And so he has to do something. He knows, even if we don't know his name, he knows that we know that there's a mole, high echelon mole with the U-2 stuff. And so he knows there has to be a mole hunt. He's the mole, right? But so so it's perfect. He gets to be the mole hunter, and he is the mole hunter. So he has a chance to design the mole hunt and protect himself. And he tells Angleton, yeah, so all the moles over there in the Soviet Russia division. Angleton believes it after 5 years, after 10 years, after 20 years. He just believes this guy. He thinks he's the greatest thing in the world. And so it's Sully who needs to design this thing, but he needs an American to come over and plop down as a defector, and it needs to be, why did this whole thing start? It started with the U-2s. So we need a guy who has some association with the U2 program. And it has to be somebody that will do exactly what we tell him to do. They knew what would happen in the embassy if Oswald said, I want to change my citizenship. They never let you do it the first time. And they want you to cool off and stuff. And so Oswald knew all these things. But how the hell did he get there so fast, too? That's the other thing. Well, that's another story I was telling you earlier. There's a way in. McCord knew it and helped him do that. But from Sully's perspective, he now has the chance to actually design a mole hunt. And so the thing is, you want a U2 guy to be the defector. He's got to be witty. So now, if you're in the U2 program, what are you? What jobs do you have? You're engineers, you're pilots, you're all these things. And it's amazing that that Oswald was in there. Like, he was a Marine, and he happened to be in the region of Atsugi. And so he was a guy who wasn't too bright, and had gotten put in the brig for a couple of times, trying to shoot somebody. Anyway, he was a guy that was a wannabe, and they knew that. You know, his favorite TV show was I Led 3 Lives. So, you know, the idea of doing some espionage, it just turned him on big. And so, but nobody who's got an advanced degree and is going to do what they asked this guy to do. He was perfect. As they said, he was a useful idiot. And so Oswald was picked. And Oswald went over there, and he was so scared he would say the wrong thing. He didn't even go out in Moscow. He never went out to see anything. He just stayed in his room the whole time. Anyway, he ends up being kept there, and he's in Minsk, and that's another part of the story. But that's how Oswald was picked, and why, and who picked him. The guy who was in the middle of this whole thing, his name is Bruce Sully. So that's what Oswald was initially, okay? Part of that whole nut roll that took place back there. He was the perfect guy. Now, fast forward to the Kennedy assassination. There's a lot of things going on in the last 6 weeks before that murder. One of them is Lee Harvey Oswald again.
Yeah.
Lee Harvey Oswald is used again, this time in the murder of the president. And what they do is they send him to Mexico City. In Mexico City, they decide they're going to hook him up with the Castro folks. He already had a beautiful record of being a defector to the Soviet Union. So we already got KGB all written all over him. So the whole summer of 1963, that's what he does. It starts actually in January. He puts a placard around his neck, Viva Fidel. Anyway, he's gone all over New Orleans, gets in fist fights with the people. He goes to a group of anti-Castro guys. He knows they are, and he pretends he takes his Marine manual and says, "I'll give you money." So he's trying to say, "I'm on your side." And the next day he's right on the corner, right next to him, with Viva Fidel stuff out there. And so there's a fist fight. They go to the courtroom, and there's TV cameras watching this whole thing. And the judge says to these Cuban guys, "How do you plead?" "Not guilty." He says, "How do you plead, Oswald?" "I'm guilty. I'm guilty." So they put him in a prison, and he has to see the FBI. And so I'll stop there. But the thing is that Oswald is now sent to Mexico City, and what they're doing is he doesn't even understand the whole time, making himself this. He's now doing his Castro thing. He's already digging his own grave. That's what it's for, because by this point he is part of the plan as the patsy. And so what happens in Mexico City is something that I had to deal with way back in my second book, Oswald and the CIA. So he goes down there, and he's supposed to try and get a visa to Cuba. Ostensibly, he says, I want to go back and defect again to the Soviet Union. So he's already come back to the United States in 1962. Now he wants to defect again. So he's a two-time commie defector there and a pro-Castro guy. And here we are. He's doing this on the last 2 days of September and the first 3 days of October 1963, in those last 6 weeks. And there's more things going on. I'll come back to Oswald. Let me just say this. During that time, those last 6 weeks, the guy that Kennedy had brought in to help out initially, way back in 61, was a Trojan horse inside the gates. Not only did he infiltrate and get charge of the Vietnam War and all that stuff, he was actually welcomed into the Kennedy family itself. Bobby named one of his 2 or 3 sons, I forget how many there were, plenty of kids anyway, as Maxwell. And that guy, Maxwell, named his son Maxwell. It's kind of embarrassing today, but it is what it is. It happened. And what he was doing the whole time was conniving with Lemnitzer and these guys who wanted the war. They didn't get it in the Cuban thing at first. They didn't get it in Berlin. We haven't had time to talk about Berlin today. Maybe another time. That was the second time that Kennedy and Khrushchev, they managed to stop it. And the third time was in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they had to talk to each other privately to resolve this, and they did again. So for 3 times, we got out of it. But here it comes. This is the fall of 63 time zone, and it's still in play. And so what's happening is now Taylor's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You know what he's doing in his last 6 weeks? He is gutting the withdrawal plan that Kennedy put on the table. There's 1,000 guys got to come out before the end of the year to cast it in concrete. See, and Kennedy says, and make sure it's real units and the helicopters too. Okay, so that doesn't happen. Taylor secretly guts the withdrawal plan, and at the same time is working with other people to actually begin something called Op Plan 34A. This is the whole invasion thing of Vietnam. And they've got false flag operations all set up to start it, which is in Tonkin. They're going to do that after he's dead. So that's what Oswald does. He is going to be the guy as a shooter who is the most crazy. You couldn't come up with a more terrible profile of a guy than Oswald, twice trying to defect to the Soviet Union. But something funny happened now. Let me go back. But anyway, I've just put on the table that the Joint Chiefs have this thing going now. So they're doing this. This is not something you can just say, oh, the bullet went here and the bullet went there. Wait a minute, wait a minute. The military is getting ready to do this thing just like they have been before. That's all going on. This Oswald thing down there is going on. And so you have multiple things happening all at the same time in this last 6 weeks. It is not just, Oswald was told go shoot or this or do that. It was a complicated thing. And what happened down there, by the way, was Oswald failed. He failed to get the visa, the Cuban visa, the transit visa before, Now, I'm going to let go all the details of that. But the point is, he was sent there to tie him to Castro and the KGB once again. That was the job. Without the visa, he fails. As long as he gets a visa, the CIA can, or not just the CIA, but this is what they're doing. The CIA is doing the cover-up. This is the cover-up before. You can't just shoot the president and decide how to cover it up after it's over. They've got a plan. And so Oswald is going to be the guy. And so Oswald is unable to do his job down there, and so but they still have to find a way to say he got to Cuba. he wasn't really going to go to Cuba, but it was going to look like he did because we had all these Cubana airline pilots on the take. The CIA did. So it was all set up. And the problem was it failed. Never mind how it failed and why it failed. But then they had to do something about that. They had to go to a plan B to tie Oswald to Castro. And the way they did that is after Oswald had his real meetings, none of which worked, then all of a sudden, Hollywood DreamWorks kicks in on Saturday. After the last time he goes over there and pleads with the Russians to give him this visa. Then there's phone calls that are made, several of them, and it's supposed to be Oswald. Now, I'm very tempted to give you details here, but it would take another several minutes. But the bottom line is this. The person who impersonated him on the phone didn't know what had happened inside those consulates. So he just had to wing it. Later on, we got access, the people, the Cubans and the Russians that were there sat down with the House Select Committee and told them what happened inside of those consulates. And let me tell you what, the guy on the phone saying his stuff doesn't match at all. He had no idea. That's why we know he wasn't Oswald. And so we've been told all these years, you got to guess between it being Oswald or being an impersonator. Guess what the answer is? Oswald was there and he was impersonated because he failed.
Okay.
And so they got the goods and it worked. But here's the third thing that was going on, right? We got one more thing you got to do. All this stuff he did in 1963 with this Cuban stuff, the CIA, the FBI is seeing it. It's on television. And he goes on the radio and debates people. And every time these things happen, the FBI, Hoover, who's not in on this, is very worried. What the hell's going on? So every time Oswald pops up with a big story, he sends a memo straight to the front desk of the CIA director to say, here's what's going on down here. Well, what happens to all those reports is they don't get put in Oswald's 201 file. He has a 201 file after he gets back. They gave him one towards the end of his time in Europe. But everything since his arrival back in the United States disappeared into another file. Over as the SAS, it was called. This is the Cuban staff, the FPC, Fair Play for Cuba Committee file, that only 1 or 2 people knew about over there. So now what happens is, because Oswald's down there, he's doing all this stuff, the station down there, the CIA station, has no idea that Oswald's coming or what it is or who he is. And so when Scott, the head of the CIA station, has to ask headquarters, well, there's a guy here, going here, there, and everywhere. His name is Oswald. Who is he? What do you know about him? And the poor guy who was in charge of the desk at headquarters to interface with the people down there, his name was John Whitten. They gave him Oswald's 201 file to answer the question with. And so he looks at it, and so he writes his report back. Well, as far as we know, Oswald's still in the Soviet Union. Our last information on him was in May 62. Even though there's a ton of stuff that other people in the FBI in the different places, they know, but over in the FBI, everything is very carefully held there. And because of the Oswald thing in the Soviet Union, from that moment on, nobody could ever look at Oswald's stuff in CIA or put something else in the file unless they went through the espionage division. Well, there's a guy in the FBI who, at the same time that Oswald does all this stuff down there, shuts down the prohibition on Oswald. In other words, he's no longer of any interest. So the red lights stop flashing in the FBI. They stop flashing in the CIA. And the only person who really cares about that are the security people. I mean, I want to say the president's security detail. All they want to know is who everybody is along the parade route. And Oswald's name isn't on that list because everything's been suppressed. So you have the suppression of all the Oswald stuff. You have what Taylor and all the Joint Chiefs are doing. You have all the things that Oswald himself is doing. You have all these things that all happen at the same time to pull this damn thing off. So when the shots ring out at Dealey Plaza, all of a sudden, all this stuff turns up. And it freaks them out. Like there's a lot of people that were, I lost count of them, all the divisions and especially all the branches, about 15, 18 of them in the CIA had done something or other here or there with Oswald, and they all had stuff in their desks about it. And well, it looks like that what they did start off with was to actually at the headquarters level, they shredded all of Oswald's stuff, but everybody else had copies and all of we put the whole damn thing together. I can show you as I have in the books that these all these things that Hoover sent to the CIA, we have every time you have another government agency send something to the CIA, there's a sheet where you have to sign your name on if it goes to your desk and the date. And so we know who saw these Hoover things that came in, and what date they saw it, and so on. And so the House Select Committee asked for those things, they refused to declassify it. And this is years after the JFK Record Act. Well, guess what? Eventually, it did get out. By the time I wrote this book, it was long. I had access to all that stuff. And so, yeah, we knew what had happened. Those things were suppressed. And so at the last minute, nobody knows anything until the shots fired happen. Then they go down, open up a bunch of these 3 triple combination safes, and guess what's in them? You guys knew this the whole time.
Yeah.
It's right there in the records.
Wow.
It was beautiful. This is this is psych warfare. They told poor Earl Warren that 40 million Americans were going to die. We know that. We have that. Johnson boasting about it. We have the tape recording. You can listen to it if you want. And Earl Warren even went on TV in Washington, D.C., WETA, and said the same story a few years later, told the same story, that he was told 40 million Americans are going to die. And he said, well, and actually, LBJ, who had talked about it on the phone, was boasting and saying, yeah, I even got him to cry. Well, that's not what Earl Warren said. When Earl Warren told the same story on television, but didn't say he cried. But what he said was, Mr. President, if it's that bad, I guess I'll have to. He didn't want to take the job. There's no way in an executive branch thing can be, you can't bring a justice guy in the middle, because what happens if it gets, he's going to recuse himself or something? You can't do that. But Hoover was at that point in on it, not before, but after the fact. And all he cared about was protecting himself and his own record. And so he didn't want to look stupid, like he'd missed something. And so he went along with just about everything. So it was perfect crime in that sense. The only problem was there were other problems. For example, one of those shooters was very, very sharp shooter, but he shot the wrong guy. But there's no doubt in my mind that the CIA had a lot to do with putting together the plan to make this thing work. And they had all kinds of people down there in Dealey Plaza walking around like tramps. And one of them, that we know of with the Cuban guys, but when you look at the jeans, it's one thing, but when you look at the pictures really closely, they got shiny black shoes on underneath. And these guys aren't shooting. They're walking around, and some of those Gladio guys are brought over from Europe. So you got those, and then about 20 people claim they killed Kennedy, so that's not possible either. So it's a big damn mess is what you got. Now, I know for a fact that when MLK was killed in 1968, we now have credible evidence. There were 2 sniper teams down there, 2 military sniper teams there for that. And the way things happen is that's, those guys are the ones who are able to do that kind of stuff. I'm going to Duquesne University this November to give my first time in many years what I think happened. in the assassination. So I've put a lot of stuff on the table today for you, but I think I'm spending a lot of your time there. It's been.
No, I want to have you back on about Dr. Martin Luther King. I want to have you back on about Lee Harvey Oswald. Let me just ask you a couple of like rapid fire, rapid.
Okay, got it.
And then we'll wrap it up. But okay, so do you believe Lee Harvey Oswald knew there were going to be other shooters?
He was certainly not told that. Nobody's going to tell him, by the way, we're going to have these other shooters and you're going to be the patsy. It didn't take him very long to figure it out.
Okay.
Right? Within about 20 minutes of the shots being fired. Yeah, he knows. He knows, he figures it out.
Well, he probably knows, okay, from my vantage point, he could see what was happening now. He also knew whether he hit the president or not.
Yeah, if he's shooting, if he's even up there, and I'll go either way on that too. It doesn't matter to me whether he's up there as a shooter or not. It was the 4th of July down there. Okay. So one way or another, that guy was going to die. Doesn't matter whether Oswald's shooting or not. Look, where he was, I'll do this. Everybody who's been in the military and used weapons as I have, look, this thing is up there. There's a huge tree right in front of you. You can't hardly see through the damn tree. Here comes a target going away into the left. You've got a fucking Carcano. They used to call it the peace weapon, and you're going to fire 5 shots in 4.2 seconds. It doesn't work. But that's what Arlen Specter, our great senator from Pennsylvania, did eventually, because that was the only way they could stitch stuff together. So I'm a conspiracy theorist, and anybody who's ever handled weapons is a conspiracy theorist. In fact, we all are. But the question is, what do we know, and why do we argue with each other incessantly about, which is the wound here and the wound there? That's for real qualified people, and there are some that we have that are able to do that. But there's just hundreds of these researchers doing forensics, as if they understand the first thing about all that goes into that.
Yeah.
So it's just a mess, and I'm embarrassed for our country, and all these people that have good motivations, but they don't belong in doing stuff if they don't understand. First of all, you have to understand what the structure of the country is, who's in charge. When does the military do stuff? And who does the coups if there's a coup? This was a coup d'etat.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I went back and watched the footage last night in slow motion. And as they're driving away from the book depository, all of a sudden you see Kennedy like right through the throat. And Jackie looks at him like, what the heck just happened? And then all of a sudden, boom. And then next thing she's on the trunk of the car. And I'm like, how is this all happening from behind, and of course, there's all the theories of, somebody on the grassy knoll and all of that. And, but I didn't know if, of course they wouldn't tell him that he was being set up. Of course they didn't tell him, we're letting you build your own crazy record. We're also leading you to build your own crazy record that we're going to spring on the American people the second we need it. It's amazing.
Well, he loved playing both sides of the street, and he died because of what a novice he was. He just didn't understand how real this, what he was playing around with. Yeah. And he got it. That's why he said, I'm just a patsy, but it was too late at that point. And he had a few hours to live. They weren't going to let him live.
Yeah. Okay. Final question. Was Kennedy taken out because he was getting in the way of all the plans that people that felt they were more important than him were trying to execute? Or was he taken out so that future presidents of the United States would also know you're not really the person in charge?
I think that the second thing there is okay, but it is not the driving force. Kennedy was in the way. And once he was gone, things went back to normal again. The one thing that didn't happen was the Armageddon. And I'll tell you why, because as you recall, it's the fall of 63, which is the time you have to do it, because by 1964, the Soviet Union is going to have a whole lot more ICBMs, and even more in 65. Well, so, and understand that the Armageddons at Berlin and Cuban Missile Crisis were resolved because Kennedy and Khrushchev had to talk to each other privately, because their subordinates were not paying attention, and that's how we got out of both of those. And so the thing is, you have Kennedy is dead, and Khrushchev is being purged. So in 1964, it's even more dangerous than it had been in Berlin and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the two were able to sit down and work it out. And so that's why you have these false flag operations are already in play. So why doesn't it happen? And the answer is real easy. You got a new president. And he says, no, we're not doing this. And now he knew that he was groomed. That's another whole thing we haven't talked about. It's in especially the new edition of JFK in Vietnam. He knew that things weren't that everything was going to hit the fan, and he didn't want it to happen when he hadn't been elected in his own right. And he said so at the time he was elected, but not before he was inaugurated. He was still 64. A reporter who wrote a book on Vietnam, Stanley Carnow. He was standing in the hallway of just outside the Oval Office, and the Joint Chiefs were standing there talking to LBJ in the hallway. And he said, "Just get me elected, and you can have your fucking war, or your damn war." And that's his ego was big enough to say, what he was trying to do was to pretend he was doing everything that Kennedy was going to do. That's why civil rights was a big thing. He might have had some interest in it, but he knew that this was going to happen. He had been prepared for it, but he was such a drunk, they didn't let him know what was going on, because he would just spill the beans. But on Air Force One on the way home, after the shooting, he's looking out the window, and one of his aides says, "Mr. President, is everything all right?" And he didn't even turn around and look. He just looked out the window and said, "Oh, the missile's flying yet." And we know that happened. That he knew, and he was afraid right then and there that it was going to happen. And so he wasn't going to go to war anywhere until he was elected. And so that's why the invasion of Vietnam didn't happen until May 65, when the Marines walked ashore.
Wow. Okay, we need to have you back on. This is some good information. I appreciate you coming on. I will make sure to put a link to all of your books. Where's the best place? Do you want me to direct them towards Amazon or a website?
Well, the website just will direct you to Amazon as well. If you want to buy the books, for example, you'll have to go to Amazon. And I do have a author page there. So you can look at the book singly, or if you go to the author page, it just has them all. And so, yeah, that's where you would find them. It's okay if you don't want to buy my books. I wasn't doing, I haven't done big podcasts because I didn't want to. I wanted to plenty of time, plenty of years to find out what I could find out, make my mistakes, fix those, and I'm ready to rock and roll now. So yeah. I'm going to go to Duquesne this fall, and I'm going to put some new stuff out. And I just put some new stuff out on McCord on your show today.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. John Newman, for coming on, all the research that you've done, and helping us better understand one of the biggest mysteries in United States history.